All right, so today we're diving into some pretty intense stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Jaime Hoerricks, uh,
Okay.
A New Emperor Ascends, Executive Orders,
Hmm.
and the Illusion of Democracy.
Big title.
Yeah, and this piece was written, get this, on a U.S. presidential inauguration day.
Oh,
So, like,
wow.
talk about timing.
Yeah, you've got this backdrop of like national celebration and promises of a fresh start and, all that.
Yeah, everyone's like popping champagne and celebrating, and exactly,
Yes.
it's kind of like, wait a second, let's talk
It's
about,
so fast.
yeah, not so fast. Let's
Yeah.
talk about like what's really going on here.
All right.
And Hoerricks is um, an autistic trans woman,
Yes.
and really throws a wrench in the typical like feel-good narrative we see around this kind of event.
Totally. I mean, that's what makes this piece so compelling, right? Is like Hoerricks is coming at us from a completely different angle.
Yeah.
And it forces us to rethink these assumptions we have about like what an inauguration really means.
So instead of just like another, peaceful transfer of power, it's like
Mhm.
Hoerricks is kind of saying, hold on, is it really all that peaceful? And, is this really a democracy we're looking at?
Exactly. They're using this inauguration as a way to dissect executive power and the stories we tell ourselves about history and whether the U.S. actually lives up to its ideals.
Yeah, so let's start with this whole inauguration spectacle, because Hoerricks really doesn't hold back. They call it a coronation, straight up,
Oh, yeah.
which is a pretty bold statement.
Definitely. I mean, it's like they're saying this isn't just a ceremony. It's about legitimizing a new ruler.
And then there's this detail about donations,
Yeah.
just this massive influx of donations,
Oh, right.
even some coming from something called the Orange Emperor's crypto meme coin.
Okay, so first of all, what even is a crypto meme coin?
I don't even know. I mean, the fact that those things exist is wild enough.
Seriously?
But then to think about them being used to fund political campaigns,
Right.
that's a whole other can of worms.
It's like this backdoor for untraceable wealth to influence elections.
It really makes you question this whole like money and politics thing.
For sure, it's like, how can we even talk about a democracy when these kinds of things are happening behind the scenes?
And aside from where the money is coming from, Hoerricks also points out just the extravagance of it all, like all this cash being splashed out on this big show while so many people are struggling to make ends meet.
It's a pretty stark contrast.
It's jarring, to say the least.
And that's exactly Hoerricks' point, right? It's like this deliberate choice to project an image of power and abundance
Yeah.
while simultaneously turning a blind eye to the needs of everyday people.
Like building a golden palace while the foundation is crumbling.
Exactly.
And this deliberate show of opulence during the inauguration makes me think about executive orders
Yep.
and how they can be used to make deliberate choices that benefit a select few.
Right.
Because Hoerricks really argues that executive orders function more like decrees from an emperor than actions of a democratically elected leader.
That's a really powerful analogy. It's like they're saying these orders are about consolidating power,
Yeah.
not about representing the will of the people.
And it's a tactic that's been used throughout history.
Right. Absolutely. Think about Roman emperors using edicts to sidestep the Senate or absolute monarchs ruling by decree.
Right.
This pattern of sidelining the legislative branch, it's got a long and troubling history.
Yeah, and for Hoerricks as a trans woman,
Yeah.
the impact of these executive orders is very personal.
Oh, for sure.
And they talk about these proposed policies like bathroom bans
Right.
and restrictions on legal name and gender changes,
Yeah.
and even defunding programs that support trans individuals.
These are policies that directly impact Hoerricks' life and the lives of countless others.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that these aren't just like abstract political footballs.
Yeah.
They have real consequences for real people.
Exactly. They have the power to drastically alter people's lives and livelihoods.
So it's clear that for Hoerricks, the personal is deeply political here.
Yeah.
It makes me think about the other examples they give, like these patriotic education initiatives.
Oh, yeah. The patriotic education. It's a slippery slope.
Yeah, because it's often used to disguise a very specific and often exclusionary narrative of American history.
It's about controlling the story, right? Like shaping what people are allowed to think and say
Yeah.
and reinforcing a particular worldview that might not reflect the full picture.
So it's not just about celebrating the country's past.
Right.
It's about pushing a very specific version of that past.
Exactly, one that conveniently leaves out some of the less than glorious chapters.
Right. And it's not just limited to classrooms either.
No.
Hoerricks points out how this control of the narrative extends to things like limiting access to certain types of literature
Right.
and suppressing critical analysis of history.
It's like they're saying, let's just focus on the shiny parts of the story and pretend the messy bits never happened.
Yeah, and maybe it makes me think about the backlash against things like the 1619 Project,
Oh, yeah.
which tried to reframe American history by centering the legacy of slavery.
And that obviously touched a nerve.
Big time.
It exposed a deep resistance to challenging those carefully constructed narratives.
Which is exactly what Hoerricks is doing, right? Like pulling back the curtain and demanding that we look at the whole picture,
Yes.
even the parts that make us uncomfortable.
And that discomfort, that willingness to challenge our own assumptions about history, that's crucial for understanding Hoerricks' critique of American power, both at home and abroad.
Right, so we've talked about this whole stage spectacle of the inauguration
Yeah.
and the use of executive orders to push through agendas while kind of glossing over some uncomfortable truths about history.
Right.
Where do we go from here?
Yes.
This feels like just the tip of the iceberg.
Oh, yeah, we've just scratched the surface.
Yeah.
We still need to unpack how these narratives about America's past are used to justify its actions on the global stage.
Okay, so buckle up, listeners, because this deep dive is about to get even more intense.
So before the break, we were talking about how these narratives about America's past, they kind of play a key role in justifying its actions around the world.
Right, like those stories aren't just for us here at home. They're also used to project a certain image to everyone else.
Exactly. And that image is what Hoerricks calls hegemony.
Hegemony.
It's about maintaining dominance, but making it look like leadership, you know?
Okay, so it's like we're trying to sell this idea of America as this benevolent leader, but
the reality is often much different.
And Hoerricks argues that the U.S. has a long history of using its military and economic might to kind of stay on top.
Right, and that doesn't always line up with the whole benevolent leader thing.
You know, while I was reading this, I kept thinking about that line, with great power comes great responsibility.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
But it seems like Hoerricks is saying that responsibility isn't always a priority.
Yeah, they definitely think that the U.S. has fallen short in that department.
And they use the example of the Orange Emperor keeping troops in Syria to secure oil fields.
Right, which raises some serious questions about motives. Like, is this really about spreading democracy or is it about something else?
Yeah, it's like, are we really about freedom or are we about securing resources and power?
And those aren't always the same thing.
Definitely not. It's like, hold on, are we about freedom or are we about, stepping on a few toes along the way?
And Hoerricks wants us to confront those uncomfortable questions.
And it's not just about military interventions, right? They also talk about things like economic sanctions,
Oh, yeah, those are a big one.
which can really cripple entire nations.
And cause immense suffering.
It's like we're projecting this image of America on one hand,
Yeah,
but then using hard power to maintain dominance on the other.
it's a two-pronged approach.
Okay, so how does this connect back to what we were talking about before with suppressing dissent at home?
Well, Hoerricks argues that those two things are inseparable. Like, to maintain that image,
Yeah.
you need control at home, and you use that power abroad to justify more control at home.
So it's like this feedback loop.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Mm.
And one of the ways Hoerricks illustrates this is through that whole thing with meta-lifting fact-checking requirements.
Oh, yeah, that was a big deal.
Basically giving misinformation the green light to spread.
Right, and that might seem like a purely digital issue, but it has real-world consequences.
Because when truth becomes fluid, it erodes trust in institutions, fuels division.
And it makes it easier to manipulate public opinion.
It's like this smoke screen that allows people with agendas to kind of operate in the shadows.
And Hoerricks connects this directly to the rise of executive power.
How so?
They argue that executive orders have become a tool for consolidating power and bypassing democratic processes.
So it's not just about controlling the narrative, it's about wielding power with less oversight
Exactly. Less accountability.
and fewer checks and balances.
Right. And Hoerricks backs this up with some historical examples like Andrew Jackson and the Indian Removal Act.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a dark chapter in U.S. history.
It shows how easily executive power can be used to violate the rights of certain groups.
And they argue that this pattern continues today.
Using executive orders to advance the interests of the wealthy and powerful, often at the expense of the most vulnerable.
It's starting to feel a bit like a rigged game, you know?
That's a powerful analogy, and it gets to the heart of Hoerricks' argument, that the system is designed to protect the few at the expense of the many.
So if the system is rigged, where do we go from here? How do we even begin to challenge something so big?
Well, Hoerricks says the first step is recognizing the problem,
Uh,
seeing the system for what it is.
A rigged game.
Exactly, and that's where critical thinking and truth-telling come in.
So we're not storing the castle just yet.
Not yet.
It's about understanding how the castle was built.
And who benefits from its existence.
But how do we actually do
It
that?
starts with questioning everything.
Everything.
Don't just accept the stories we're told, especially the ones that make us feel comfortable.
So be
Be
skeptical.
curious, be discerning like a detective, you know?
Okay, so we're like intellectual rebels now,
Exactly.
challenging the status quo.
That's the spirit.
I like it. And this rebellious spirit also applies to how we consume information.
Right. We need to diversify our media diets, seek out independent sources.
So it's not just about what we think, but also about where we're getting our information.
Exactly, because if we're constantly surrounded by the same narratives, we get stuck in an echo chamber.
It's like that saying, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention.
Yeah.
But I think Hoerricks is saying, if you're not questioning, you're not really thinking.
That's a great way to put it.
And this questioning mindset can lead to some really interesting insights.
Like Hoerricks points to Das Kapital as an example of how deep critical analysis can expose the flaws in systems we take for granted.
So it's not just about feeling outraged.
Right.
It's about understanding the root causes.
And using that knowledge to empower ourselves.
This is starting to feel like a blueprint for a more conscious society,
That's the goal.
where people are empowered to think for themselves and challenge the status quo.
And that kind of transformation requires collective action.
So it's not just about individual change.
It's about building communities of resistance supporting each other.
It makes me think about all the different movements and organizations fighting for social justice.
Yeah, there's this growing wave of people who are saying enough is enough.
And Hoerricks reminds us that the empire isn't invincible.
Its power rests on the consent of the governed.
So it's like a contract.
In a way, yeah.
And if enough people disagree with the terms,
The whole thing can fall apart.
so we have more power than we realize.
We absolutely do.
And withdrawing consent can take many forms, right?
Protests, boycotts, even just refusing to participate in systems that perpetuate injustice.
It's about recognizing our own power, even when things feel overwhelming,
Exactly, and that's a message we need to hold on to.
especially when things feel bleak.
Right, because Hoerricks reminds us that change is always possible.
But it takes courage
And persistence.
and a willingness to challenge the way things are.
It's like they're saying, don't underestimate the power of a small group of people to change the world.
And they also offer some concrete steps we can take, like supporting organizations fighting for social justice,
Engaging in meaningful dialogue with others?
using our voices to amplify the voices of those who are marginalized. So it's about taking action in our communities and in the wider world,
Exactly. And even small acts can make a difference.
planting seeds of change wherever we can,
And as those seeds grow, we can start to imagine a different future.
one where power is more evenly distributed
So where truth is valued,
and where justice prevails.
that's the vision.
And Hoerricks' work reminds us that we're not just passive observers
We have the power to shape the narrative
to challenge the status quo.
and to create a more just world. So the question is, will we rise to meet the challenge?
Okay, so welcome back to the deep dive. We've been exploring Jaime Hoerricks' A New Emperor Ascends. And I gotta say, my mind is blown. We've talked about so much already.
Right, like inaugurations and executive orders and how history gets rewritten.
Yeah, and how all of that is connected to power and control.
And how those in charge often try to manipulate the narrative.
Exactly. But the good news is Hoerricks doesn't just leave us hanging. They offer a path forward.
Right? They urge us to embrace critical thinking and truth-telling as tools for dismantling these systems of power.
Yeah, it's like we've been handed this decoder ring, and now we can see the matrix for what it is.
Exactly.
But where do we even begin?
Right.
How do we actually put these tools into practice?
Well, Hoerricks suggests we start by questioning everything. Like, don't just accept the stories we're told, especially the ones that make us feel comfortable or patriotic.
So cultivate a healthy skepticism.
Yeah, be curious and discerning like a detective.
Okay, so we're like intellectual rebels, challenging the status quo with every thought.
That's the spirit. And this rebellious spirit should also extend to how we consume information.
Meaning?
We need to diversify our media diets, seek out independent sources, you know?
Okay, so it's not just about what we think, but also about where we're getting our information from.
Exactly, because if we're constantly bombarded with the same narratives, we get trapped in an echo chamber.
And then we just end up reinforcing our existing biases.
Right, we need to actively seek out different perspectives to get a more complete picture.
It's like that saying, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention.
Yeah, but I think Hoerricks takes it a step further and says, if you're not questioning, you're not really thinking.
That's a good one.
And that questioning mindset can lead us to some pretty profound insights.
Like what?
Well, Hoerricks points to works like Das Kapital as an example of how deep critical analysis can expose the flaws in systems we often take for granted.
So it's not just about feeling outraged, it's about understanding the root causes of that outrage.
Exactly, and using that knowledge to empower ourselves.
I like that. Knowledge is a form of empowerment.
Right, because when we understand how power operates, we're less likely to be swayed by propaganda or empty rhetoric.
This is all starting to feel like a blueprint for a more conscious and informed society,
That's exactly what Hoerricks is advocating for.
where people are empowered to think for themselves and challenge the status quo.
And that kind of transformation doesn't just happen at an individual level, it requires collective action.
So we need to build communities of resistance.
Exactly. We need to support each other in the fight for a more just world.
It makes me think about all the different movements and organizations working to challenge injustice.
Right, from grassroots activists to organizations fighting for social and environmental justice.
It feels like there's this growing wave of people waking up and saying, enough is enough.
And Hoerricks reminds us that the empire isn't invincible.
Because
Its power ultimately rests on the consent of the governed.
so if enough people withdraw their consent,
The whole system starts to crumble.
and that withdrawing of consent can take many forms, right?
Absolutely, from peaceful protests to boycotts to simply refusing to participate in systems that perpetuate injustice.
It's about recognizing our own power, even in the face of these seemingly overwhelming forces.
And that's a crucial message to hold on to, especially when things feel bleak.
Because change is always possible.
It takes courage and persistence and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
But as Hoerricks reminds us, don't underestimate the power of a small group of committed individuals to change the world.
And they don't just offer words of encouragement, they also provide some practical steps we can take.
Like what?
Supporting organizations fighting for social justice, engaging in meaningful dialogue with others, using our voices to amplify the voices of those who are marginalized.
So taking action in our communities and in the wider world.
Exactly. And even small acts can make a difference.
Donating to a cause, volunteering our time, having a difficult conversation with a friend or family member.
It's all about planting those seeds of change wherever we can.
And as those seeds take root, we can start to imagine a different future.
A future where power is more evenly distributed, where truth is valued, and where justice prevails.
Hoerricks' work is such a powerful reminder that we're not just passive observers in all of this. We have the power to shape the narrative, to challenge the status quo, and to create a more just world.
The question is, will we rise to meet the challenge?
And that's a question each of us has to answer for ourselves. But one thing's for sure, after diving deep into A New Emperor Ascends, we can never look at those imperial robes the same way again. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We hope this conversation has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to see the world with fresh eyes.